My name is Fountain Hughes. My grandfather belonged to Thomas Jefferson.
All that I know, the teachers of mine, your master and your missus. I remember picking cotton.
They'd have an auction bench, and they put you up on the bench and bid on you, the same as you're bidding on cattle, you know.
Well, they take that old woman, poor old woman, cat in the peach orchard and whipped her. You know, and then snuffed the pipe out on her, you know. You know, the embers in the pipe.
If I thought that I'd ever be a slave again, I'd take a run and just end it all right away.
You can't understand United States history without understanding the role that slavery played. It was already a very formal institution by the time the United States became a nation. It actually defined the nation.
Slavery didn't just end and go away. We as a country were formed out of a compromise with slavery. The Southern colonies were not willing to be part of a union, part of a national government, unless the institution of slavery was protected. And the price of protecting that institution was disproportionate power to the South politically. And it carries through today.
We possibly could have lightened some of the consequences of slavery if there had not been such a concerted effort to maintain the differences between blacks and whites. It's kind of like an infection, I think. You know, it may go away, but it always bubbles back up to the top eventually. I think that's what's happening now.
They're mad. I'm mad. We should all be mad, man. We should all be angry because of what's going on right now.
Law enforcement sources tell CNN Wolf admitted that he shot worshipers in cold blood as they gathered for a Bible study Wednesday at historic Emmanuel AME Church. His chilling motive? One source tells CNN that the 21-year-old wanted to start a race war.
God, nothing ever changes here. Why does this keep happening over and over again? I was born in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1963, into a world where white superiority was rarely questioned. As a child, the only black people I ever interacted with in a meaningful way were the people who worked for us. I loved them like family. I felt a huge amount of sadness as a kid seeing how they and other African Americans were treated in the South. I didn't understand it. I knew something was deeply wrong, but it was not okay to talk about it. My longtime friend and producing partner, Sally Holtz, and I shared a similar upbringing.
You know, I felt it. It was confusion, it was crazy making, and anger.
Like Sally, the sorrow, anger, and lingering questions about the racist South of my childhood shadowed me into adulthood. I never understood how much my own uncomfortable journey to talk about this was connected to an untold history of our nation.
You know, it's hard to be black in a world controlled by white folks. Du Bois said we always have the double consciousness. We trying to be black, and meanwhile you got a white ghost hovering over your head that says, if you don't do this, you'll get killed. If you don't do this, you won't get no money. If you don't do this, nobody will think you're beautiful. If you don't do this, nobody will think you're smart. That's the ghost.
The transatlantic slave trade took off in the early 18th century and produced huge profits.
One of the reasons why the United States is such an advanced country is because of not only slavery, but the slave trade. We know that slavery was financed from places like New York, Rhode Island, Newport, and Boston.
One of the reasons Wall Street was created in the first place was to finance the slave industry, everything from buying slaves to even mortgaging them.
What you see is not only the building of more ships, which employs workers. You're seeing the building of insurance companies because Africans are revolting and you need to have insurance policies. You see the construction of banking because these voyages have to be financed. And therein, you begin to see the seeds, the kernels of an advanced economic system. And the rise of capitalism is clearly on the backs of slavery and the enslaved Africans.
It was astonishing to me that many of the first Africans in the American colonies weren't slaves, but indentured servants. For a while, poor blacks and whites worked alongside each other.
The connection between Europeans and Africans was actually quite robust. A lot of marriages, formally and informally, a lot of children, formally and informally, probably much greater integration between people of African descent and European descent than we have today.
Indentured whites and blacks worked for their masters for 5 to 7 years. Africans went from indentured servitude to enslavement gradually, one colony, one person, and one law at a time.
It started with the dispossession of Native Americans, so the concept that they didn't actually have title to the land or deserve the land because they weren't Christians. So all of U.S. law around land and the accumulation of land by the English and French and Spanish was based upon that. Europeans felt completely comfortable going into Africa and enslaving people who were also heathens, non-Christians, and bringing them to the New World, to South and Central and North America. And so slavery was justified by this. It allowed the conquerors to feel righteous, that they were in fact doing favors to whoever they encountered. It was all redefined as a benevolent process.
To most people's mind, America means white. The country was founded by two groups, Anglos and Saxons, Christian, Protestant, English-speaking. So all these things get bound up together.
Just being Christian was not distinction enough to separate who was entitled to civil rights and respect and resources. So Christianity became divided into white Christians, really white male Christians, and everybody else. There was a racial supremacy and a religious supremacy intertwined.
Yet 1,000 black and white Virginians rose up together in rebellion against rich planters in 1676. The rebels wanted more wealth and power in the new America. Nathaniel Bacon led the uprising.
The Bacon Rebellion was both a political movement and an economic movement. It was people demanding democracy, a chance to participate in running the colony, Virginia colony, and demanding land.
There were these people coming together more along class lines than race lines. And even though the colonial government was eventually successful, I think that really scared them.
The elite decided to split those groups and start creating whiteness in the colonies. And part of their charge for all the men was to be drafted into the slave patrol to manage the slaves for the elites. And they always had this role of allegiance to the elites and managing those underneath for the elites.
This notion of divide and conquer, to keep poor whites always knowing that they were not at the bottom.
No matter how degraded you may be as a white, you're white. And there's one group below you. That seems very simple enough, but it was a very heavy curse.
Virginia, where my ancestors originally settled, was the first colony to pass harsher slave laws that legally sealed this new alliance between rich planters and poor whites.
The first kind of white privilege that we see in this country is what was given to indentured servants as they were freed up to have some land, to have the ability to be in the militia, in the slave patrols, to get cloth and tools and other things when they were released. They just still didn't have economic power, but they had benefits as white people, and at the same time, enslaved Africans had nothing. They had no rights, no property, nothing in their name at all.
Growing up, I knew both sides of my family owned slaves, but there was never much of a conversation about it. Our family history haunted me enough to make this film. My most famous ancestor was a guy named Edmund Pendleton, who was a judge, planter, and slave owner. Pendleton was my uncle, 6 times removed. I had known a bit about Pendleton's life, but in my research for this film, I discovered more details than I ever bargained for.
Pendleton was tall, handsome. He was charming. He was a brilliant man. He was an arch conservative, what we would today call a right-wing extremist. He went from being an arch conservative to being a spokesman for the revolution.
Pendleton became the first governor of the Virginia colony, and I was kind of proud to learn that he played a major role in helping to establish the new nation.
Pendleton drafts the Virginia Resolution for Independence, and that says that the delegation be instructed to propose to declare the United Colonies free and independent states, absolved from all allegiance or dependence upon the Crown or Parliament of Great Britain. He wrote all those words, which were then given to a Pony Express rider who carried them to Philadelphia. When they got to Philadelphia, they said, "Virginia says independence," and all the other colonies fell into place.
But I was really disturbed to learn that Pendleton was also asked to write a controversial line in the Virginia Declaration of Rights, words that would institutionalize white supremacy and reverberate throughout U.S. history.
I have written a little bit about Virginia founder Edmund Pendleton, and there's not a lot of people that know very much about Edmund Pendleton, and Francis is related to Edmund.
As I understand the history, they said, wait a minute, we can't have these principles of liberty applying to slaves. And so he comes up with the line basically that signals in kind of coded language to the other slave owners that they're going to exclude the slaves from liberty, that all men by nature are equally free and independent and have certain rights. And he came up with the line, when they enter into a state of society, which everyone understood to mean that the slaves would be excluded.
Slaves weren't even considered human, so how would they ever be accepted into civil society? But still, slavery was controversial. I wondered, did Pendleton and the other founding fathers have a more pressing reason to break from Great Britain?
London had moved, in Somerset's case in 1772, to abolish slavery within England. There was a lot of fear and suspicion on this side of the Atlantic that that particular decision would have legs.
I was always taught the Revolutionary War was about things like freedom and taxation without representation. So was independence from Great Britain really much more about preserving slavery?
Almost every founding father was a slave owner. Slavery was an integral part not just of the Southern economy, but the entire Northern economy. So it was just completely integrated into the thinking of the wealthy men that wrote the Constitution.
So the fact that the Constitution is the perfect instrument is just bogus from the start if you admit, and this is the only truth that you can arrive at, that because it did not ban the slavery and it left it in there, and then it left it as an open-ended question, slavery is definitely one of the root causes of the current political melees that we have today.
My uncle led Virginia's ratification of the U.S. Constitution in 1788, which included the Three-Fifths Compromise. Slaves were counted as 3/5 of a voter, though slaves couldn't vote. Because the South had more slaves than the North, this gave the South 1/3 more congressional seats and electoral votes for the next 73 years. Slaveholding interests would dominate the government until the outbreak of the Civil War. Not surprisingly, 5 of the first 7 U.S. presidents were from the South and were slave owners.
The historians have done a disservice because you would think that there are all these genteel men with wigs and bringing ideas or coming up with all of these projects and plans. Yes, they get their hands dirty fighting the redcoats, but then it's back to dreaming up Bill of Rights and constitutions and other brilliant ideas, and without the sort of muck and the grime and the dirt and the blood that's being shed to build this society.
If they want you to cut all night long out in the field, you cut. And if they want you to hang all night long, you hang your back. It didn't matter about your tired, being tired, you're afraid to say you're tired.
But many more slaves than is commonly acknowledged resisted the brutality or tried to escape. Others organized and rebelled against their treatment. A successful and bloody revolution led by slaves in nearby Haiti established the first black-led republic in the world. This revolt terrified American slave owners, like my ancestors, who feared slave rebellions would spread to the U.S. I imagine that's why we never learned much about the Haitian Revolution in school.
The Haitian Revolution puts the fear of God, if I may use that phrase, into the brains of slave owners. It's a major factor in shedding light on this Negrophobia, this fear and hatred of Africans. You not only have to think about the classic slave revolts, Nat Turner, Denmark Vesey, Gabriel Prosser. This free labor comes with a price. It comes with the price of having your throat slit in the middle of the night. It comes with the price of eating your scrambled eggs in the morning and then keeling over and dying from the poison. It comes from with the price of your house going up in flames and your barn going up in flames and all the crops going up in flames by rebellious Africans. The kind of tumult that is gripping North America.
In the midst of this national nightmare, there were white people who opposed slavery.
There was a growing unease that this might actually be wrong, that morally it was hard to justify.
5 northern states had started to either eliminate or gradually abolish slavery. And in Virginia, of all places, I discovered a powerful and unusual story from that era which had been lost to history.
We're in Nominee Hall Estate in Westmoreland County, Virginia. This is an estate that was owned by Robert Carter III, a man who manumitted, freed my ancestors with a deed of manumission in 1791. So all around here are the land where my ancestors lived and worked. as slaves and were eventually freed gradually over 20 years.
Carter is a very good example of one of the richest landowners in the country who saw that slavery was wrong and did something about it.
Though he was widely condemned by other slave owners and even his own family, Carter gradually freed all 452 of his slaves.
You can see it in the actual verbiage of the deed of gift. He talks about the fact that he felt that it was against the principles of religious justice. He literally believed that it was not God's will to have slaves. Several of my ancestors were on that original first 15 that he freed. One specifically, Chris Newman. She was born in 1742 here in America, and she lived here at Nominal Hall. When she was freed, she was 49 years old. She was a weaver.
As freed African Americans, we had certain advantages. We had the liberty to go where we wanted to go. We had the liberty to work as much as we wanted to thrive, to provide for our families. So we see John Thompson Sr. owning land shortly after he was manumitted. Before that, he owned personal property items like horses, pigs, implements, farm tools, that sort of thing. But he actually began to own land about 1820.
Tom and LaTanya's ancestors had a very different experience than most Africans in America. Not until President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation 70 years later were so many slaves freed. What would our country look like today if others had followed in Carter's footsteps? But we didn't. Instead, we deepened our commitment to slavery with even harsher laws. Sadly, one of the main architects of those laws was my uncle, Edmund Pendleton.
If you were freed, you would have to register with the county, put down your height and any distinguishing features. This was to make sure that you restricted what they did, you knew where they were.
The laws were so convoluted. If you went into debt, you could become a slave again. If someone brought a case against you, you could become a slave again.
International pressure and the successful revolution in Haiti forced the U.S. Congress to ban the importation of new slaves. So what did Southern slave owners do to maintain and grow their profits? They bred more and more slaves.
If you travel in Virginia today, I think it's Charles City, which is not that far from Richmond, you'll find evidences today of Virginia as this great breeding colony where you're breeding Africans like you're breeding cattle.
The demand for slaves exploded because of Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin. Cotton became the most profitable commodity in the world. In this era, 1 million out of the 2 million slaves in the U.S. were brutally separated from their families and forcibly marched to the Deep South to plant and pick cotton. This site that blends into the bustling city landscape of New Orleans was one of the nation's busiest slave auction blocks. Yet there was not even a plaque or a marker that acknowledged the suffering that took place here. This denial bothered me deeply. It felt like a whitewashing of history. But this was very familiar. This version of history was peddled to me in school books throughout my childhood. I felt haunted by the spirits of the slaves who had been so terrorized here.
I've seen two men that were punishing for what they do. and they take them, hang them up with a thumb. That's the punishment they got.
The frenzy for profits produced by cotton and the sale of slaves in the new states also increased the physical violence against them. More productivity came through extreme punishment, with overseers even calculating how many lashes on the back of a slave might generate 1 more pound of cotton. This cruelty and the forced separation from their families led more slaves to try to escape.
The United States Supreme Court sanctioned a law, the Fugitive Slaves Law, that requires the country to hunt slaves no matter where they are. There's no provision for that in the Constitution. So we have this extremely broad reading of the rights of slave owners, which basically says the state can deputize every citizen in the United States to hunt down slavery, whether you're in a slave state or not. The country is going to all this length to protect slavery.
By now, I was seeing a deeply troubling pattern in our history. White people, whether they owned slaves or not, clearly had a stake in making sure that the majority of blacks were maintained as slaves. But what Sally and I discovered was that just one step over the border in Canada, they were offering Africans from the U.S. the possibility of a radically different life.
Canada was originally a British colony, so we had to abide by the laws of England. Automatically, by the 1830s, there was no slavery allowed in what is now Canada.
Now this is Sylvia.
This is Sylvia.
Okay,
Yes.
so she's your great-grandmother,
She's
right?
my great-grandmother. And she was the mother of my mother's mother. And she never talked to us about being free. We just knew she was happy.
We met up with the great-granddaughter of Sylvia Stark, a former slave who lived to be 105. Sylvia was the youngest child of Howard and Hannah Estes, who were born into slavery in Missouri.
And this is Howard.
Yes.
The patriarch of the family,
Right.
Howard Estes.
The Estes and Stark family's history is a rather complicated one. It starts in Missouri. Howard's master wanted to send a herd of cattle over the mountains to California during the big gold rush after 1849. And Howard was asked to accompany the master's son. And he could stay there and earn some money and purchase his freedom, which was going to be $1,000.
Howard Estes managed to buy his family's freedom, receiving in return their freedom papers.
These are the papers that freed them. And this is all written here. This is in their...
And to have this.
Yes, yes.
Wow.
It says 18... So these papers were written up so that they'd have proof that they were freed slaves. It says, "Know all men by these present that I, Howard Estes, of the county of Clay in the state of Missouri,
They arrived in time to find some gold, but the blacks that were in California were now getting fearful that California, which was admitted to the United States 9 years earlier, was now in danger of becoming a slave state. So the blacks were quite afraid.
At the same time, a slave named Dred Scott, who had been taken by his owner to non-slave states, claimed that he was therefore free and entitled to U.S. citizenship. Scott sued, but the U.S. Supreme Court ruled against him.
Chief Judge Taney said, no blacks, free or otherwise, could ever be a citizen of the United States. And it was the first time the Supreme Court dealt with citizenship. And it went to great length to say that blacks were never meant to be part of the political community.
The situation in California, where they were ostensibly free, was beginning to heat up. So the Fugitive Slave Act, the Dred Scott decision, and then individual decisions in places like San Francisco that banned black children from attending school made it apparently very, very difficult for some of them.
So they wrote a letter, can you imagine that? Wrote a letter to Governor James Douglas and told them what they were going through and that they needed a place to live.
The first governor of British Columbia, James Douglas, was born in Africa. His mother was mixed race and his father was Scottish. Douglas frequently identified as black.
He wrote them back and said, bring all of them. If you want to come to Canada. He said, we have a big country and we're trying to make it grow.
By 1860, Sylvia Estes had married farmer Lewis Stark in California, and they had 2 children. They were among 800 free blacks who accepted the invitation from Governor Douglas.
He rode over here and he saw this island, this beautiful island, and there was nobody on it. And she says, that's where I want to go. And they preempted land in 3 spots on Salt Spring. This is the one she loved the most. And this is where she made her life.
I was inspired by Sylvia's grit and inner strength.
Granny made her own soap. She made her own butter. She had a machine where she could cord and do her own weaving. She did all of that herself.
When they arrived, they were offered land. They were told they could live here free. There was no slavery in this part of the world. And most of them stayed here and farmed and raised their family and had a fairly good life.
Many of them opened businesses, and very quickly, many of them became citizens. And they voted, and one quickly became elected to city council.
The stories of these courageous black pioneers in Canada contradicted every stereotype I was exposed to growing up in the South. A culture that insisted that blacks were lazy, unintelligent, and incapable of managing their own lives. The new black Canadians made obvious just how much of a lie this was.
Oh, I'm God's religion. Oh, I'm God's religion. Oh, I'm God's religion.
This church was built by Charles Alexander from his design with the farmers of the neighborhood. So all farmers, no matter who you were or what you were able to attend this church.
The integration was very real, but in fact, there was discrimination, personal discrimination. Some blacks were not allowed to go into certain theaters or drink in certain bars.
Just as the California gold rush was ending, a major gold vein was discovered in British Columbia. It brought a familiar foe to the black community, U.S. Southerners. Were free blacks safe anywhere?
There were whites with views from the American South who came up, and they were not open to sharing the land or their businesses or their theaters or their saloons or what have you with the now African Canadian community.
Canada had become a haven for Southern Civil War criminals, now on the run from that crushing American conflict, which began in 1861. Hanging in the balance were the lives of 4 million enslaved human beings in the U.S. whose monetary value now exceeded that of all manufacturing and commercial enterprises combined. Seven slave states had broken away from the U.S., forming the Confederacy. America's Civil War was fought for 4 horrific years to save the Union. When I was young, I heard stories about how bravely my ancestors fought and how much the family lost in the War of Northern Aggression. To win the war, President Abraham Lincoln issued his Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, freeing Southern slaves so they could fight for the Union. Only with the war's end were Northern slaves finally freed.
What happens at the moment black men and women are told, you're no longer slaves. You're free. You can do whatever you want to do. It's a great moment in our history.
They say, well, hi, all of you niggas is all free now. Yankees all going home.
It's called sometimes a day of Jubilee. Well, there was no real Jubilee because everybody was uncertain. Blacks were uncertain. And they did say, how free is free? How free is free?
Mom and them didn't know where to go. You see, after freedom broke, they didn't know where to go.
The idea that these 4 million people were set free without any kind of reparation. They had worked, their ancestors had worked, they helped to build all of the institutions that we think about in the South and in the North before the Revolution, and they received nothing.
But we didn't have no property, we didn't have no home, we had nowhere, nothing, we didn't have nothing on it, just get along the best you could.
Northern General William Sherman understood the desperate plight of the freed slaves. He gave 40,000 of them 40 acres of land and a mule. But even today, many people don't know that President Andrew Johnson, a former slaveholder who had succeeded the assassinated Abraham Lincoln, quickly revoked that, evicting blacks from their land. White settlers were getting cheap land in the West under the Homestead Act. Understandably, freed blacks wanted land in the South, where most of them still lived. But instead, the federal government abandoned the freed slaves and sold confiscated Southern land to Northern whites and the railroads.
There's a fear, and I think rightly so, that Southerners were not going to necessarily treat freed slaves as equal citizens, regardless of, the laws that were passed. They were going to need some support behind that.
Pressured by abolitionists, the federal government amended the Constitution by passing the Reconstruction Amendments, which officially ended slavery and gave U.S. citizenship to ex-slaves. The amendments were supposed to protect freed slaves against future discrimination.
The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment was designed to try to interrupt the institution of slavery, which requires a re-articulation of the entire country and their entire country identity, not just for the South, but for the entire country.
What happened during Reconstruction, more important than anything else, is that black men, women to some extent, but black men learned the uses of political power.
By 1870, Black males could now vote, and vote they did in record numbers. 3 blacks were even elected to the U.S. Senate. Not until 1967 was another black elected as a U.S. senator.
I'm going to see that the welcome
Blacks organized themselves into a political force through meetings at their churches. Black churches, like the African Methodist Episcopal Church, would continue the fight for equal rights.
They threatened to succeed in this aspiration. But the whites feared more than anything else that Reconstruction might succeed in reordering Southern society. Whites had an intense hatred for blacks who wanted to get ahead. A successful black was a dangerous black. An incompetent, illiterate black posed no threat. His labor was valuable. But the black who got out of his place, who aspired to anything above the place to which he had been assigned, that is the kind of black that whites could not tolerate.
So the country started in that road, and then they reneged, and they decided to basically to create another expression of racial dominance.
The Southerners wanted to control these 4 million people that had been freed. They still needed them to do the work. They also needed them to understand and to know their place. And this was something that even Northerners would come to understand and agree with, that the states were really free to do whatever they wanted to do in terms of controlling this inferior people as they continue to see them.
Without federal enforcement of the new civil rights legislation, the states enacted the Black Codes. These punitive laws restricted the movement of blacks, rigged the labor economy against them, and doomed them to low wages and debt. The laws also opened the door to the widespread use of convict leasing, which was just another form of slavery.
So if you broke these laws, then you could be in prison for it. And so then that starts the cycle of people going to prison for really trivial reasons, but getting caught up in the system, because then if a white landholder or business person paid their fine, then they had to work off that fine. And so you could be years, maybe for the rest of your life, in these situations because these people were not an investment like they had been during slavery. So you could work them to death, get them replaced, and move on.
The Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court decision in 1896 created separate but equal, the legal separation between black and white. It's always been hard for me to believe that these so-called Jim Crow laws that blatantly discriminated against African Americans remained in place until 1964. Jim Crow created America's own system of apartheid.
Jim Crow was really born in the South, although it would go north, certainly, but in the South it would become legal. It would become part of state laws, local laws, everything from separate Bibles for people to swear on in court. I interviewed a lady once who told me she worked in a shirt factory and they had separate coat hooks. They had separate bathrooms. They had separate cemeteries. Everything that you can imagine. Intermarrying was illegal to do. And these were codified in the South. In the North, they became kind of part of the custom, but not necessarily part of the law.
I think it's fair to say that Dixie, the so-called white South, has left a very deep imprint on the political culture of the United States. It was defeated militarily during the Civil War, but not defeated politically, because its white supremacist ideas were not defeated. And in fact, it seems as if the part of the reconciliation between Dixie and the rest of the country is to give Dixie a pass.
The South had lost nearly everything in the war, but we refused to surrender. Instead, we united around a strange myth known as the lost cause. I grew up surrounded by it. It was always the Yankees or the War of Northern Aggression. Life before the war was romanticized as one of content slaves and idyllic plantation life. Monuments to Confederate battlefields and generals were everywhere. We were a separate people who were superior, distinct, and noble. But I always felt that beneath this mask of Southern gentility and outward politeness was a culture that was deeply flawed at its core.
To Southern boys who are here today, our little Southern town has blood on the way. It's a way of life to end a life.
If you investigate these lynchings to any great extent, which I have, you can't believe that it really happened in your country, in this country. And the country still stands in great denial.
More lynchings were recorded in the United States from 1890 to the 1920s than at any other time in our history. These tactics were used with terrifying effect, particularly at night, by the notorious white supremacist group, the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan's primary goal was to keep African Americans in their place by any means necessary. As a child, the images of these white-robed terrorists really frightened me, just knowing that they were among us. Hollywood's first feature film, Birth of a Nation, which romanticized the Ku Klux Klan, was released in 1915. To protest the film, large numbers of African Americans assembled publicly for the first time in the 20th century in Boston and other places. It was the Southern Klan's violence and a labor shortage after World War I that drove 1.6 million African Americans from the South to the North and Midwest. There, they worked in the steel mills, railroads, meatpacking plants, and automobile industry. But poll taxes, literacy tests, and the Klan's intimidation in the North kept blacks from voting there.
You expect nothing from the federal government. There are no, quote, good presidents, unquote, during this entire period. Probably the worst of them all is Woodrow Wilson, when the nation's capital assumes the whole mantle of Jim Crow. And it's because Wilson, a deep Virginian, can't stand to see successful blacks around him. And he makes a point of demoting them, sending them from the offices to the kitchens. He takes great pride in this.
The South is neither Democrat nor Republican. The South has always been a party organized around racial domination and white supremacy. And it was one of the things that made the South so strong, because they had a single party state.
You also had Northern politicians who pandered to the South. Because the South, as they called it, the solid South, was such a voting bloc, if you were a Northern politician, and even if you had ideas of fairness, not even say equality, but just fairness, and that black people were human beings, but at the same time, you wanted to win the South, or you needed to win the South to be elected. You had to step lightly around the Southerners.
The South put this restored national power to work, maintaining the nation's racial hierarchy with its veto power. Southern politicians tarnished the creation of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal.
Roosevelt himself is a very good example of this, that he has to make certain compromises. He has to tell Walter White of the NAACP, I'm sorry, I can't sign this anti-lynching bill. The bill is to make lynching a federal crime. That would be a big step. And the opposition to that is so intense. So Roosevelt himself says, look, if I do this, then forget about the New Deal.
Roosevelt's New Deal created relief programs to put people back to work during the Great Depression. But Southern politicians made sure the new federal job benefits programs, Social Security, the minimum wage, unemployment insurance, and union organizing did not apply to the two primary black vocations of the era, agricultural and domestic service. The jackpot that followed the American victory in World War II, which gave birth to the American dream, good housing, education, and employment, was off limits to most African Americans. Nowhere was systemic racism more on display than in our national housing policy, also created by the New Deal.
It was the government leading the way in creating a segregated landscape in every metropolitan area in this country. You had many neighborhoods with European immigrants, African Americans, whites who came from rural areas to work in factories in the same neighborhood. But in fact, what the Public Works Administration did with its housing program was create segregation where none had existed before. It built public housing in those neighborhoods, demolishing the integrated neighborhood to create land for the public housing, and built segregated public housing instead.
Returning black World War II veterans were forced to live in this segregated housing because Dixiecrats vetoed an amendment in the 1949 Housing Act that would have reintegrated housing.
This is crazy. We are fighting a war supposedly to make this world safe for democracy. We're fighting a war in which the enemy is a racist Nazi Germany that's exterminating Jews, and we're being treated as second-class citizens here in the United States. It makes no sense.
Even historically oppressed European ethnic groups, like Italians, Jews, and Irish Americans, were allowed to buy into the new suburban housing built for returning white war veterans.
Throughout the country, mass production builders got bank loans guaranteed by the Federal Housing Administration on condition that no homes be sold to blacks. Perhaps the best example is Levittown in New York. In Levittown, the builder Levitt and Company built 17,000 homes in Nassau County, east of New York City. Black veterans were not permitted to live there. White veterans were.
Good-paying industry jobs followed whites to the new suburbs. The white families, like mine, who owned their homes, gained several $100,000 worth of equity over decades. The white middle class was born. The Federal Housing Authority made it illegal for lenders to loan money to blacks who wanted to buy houses in white neighborhoods. Redlining by banks denied mortgages to black people even in their own communities.
If you have a family member who can pass on to you a certain amount of money, then you can start off buying a home as opposed to renting, or going to college as opposed to not going to college. So that ability to pass on wealth quite often it's stymied in the Black community because it hasn't been built. And I think a lot of whites don't understand that a lot of Blacks weren't able to make wealth that they could pass down. Everyone is starting over from day one.
About this time, Sally and I were born into a land of plenty and privilege, where the line between black and white was very clear. Slavery has cast a long shadow in Sally's hometown of Meridian, Mississippi. Being here prompts memories of her beloved housekeeper and friend, Annice.
And I remember going to the soda fountain, and then I would sit at the soda fountain, and Annice would be standing behind me. I'd go, why aren't you sitting with me? And she said, it's okay, honey, I'll just stay back here. She had to go into the bathroom that said coloreds, sit at the back of the bus, go to the back doors of restaurants. It made no sense to me that here was the most wonderful woman in my life, and she was being mistreated. I never understood that. She took care of us. She did the laundry, she cleaned the house, and she cooked. She did everything from sunup to sundown, 5 days a week. And she left her 6 children at home, had to make arrangements for them. I don't know how she did it.
This was our cloistered world. But all around us, big changes were happening. Not far from Sally's home, 3 civil rights workers were savagely murdered in 1964 by the Ku Klux Klan. Meridian became a flashpoint for the civil rights struggle.
We are determined to be free. That's right. We've gone too far to turn back. Let us be calm. We are together. We are not afraid. Amen. And we shall overcome.
This girl here was the first Negro apparently of high school age to show up at Central High School the day that the federal court ordered it integrated.
And these changes are coming faster than I expected. It's difficult for me, it's difficult for all Southerners.
And Supreme Court or no Supreme Court, we are going to maintain segregated schools down in Dixon.
There was an understanding that Southerners were not going to easily give up their control, their power, this idea of the inequality between the races. There was always this understanding that there was going to need to be this federal intervention on the level of a Civil Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 in this case.
Lyndon Johnson said when the Civil Rights Bill was passed, he said, I wanted this. I supported it. But I'm telling you, I think we probably lost the South. But Johnson thought it was worth it.
It's not just Negroes, but really it's all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. And we shall overcome.
The legal discrimination against African Americans that began in the 1600s would officially end in 1964 with the enactment of the Civil Rights Act.
It finally gave some teeth to the 14th Amendment. Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of '64 was very, very important because it said that if you were receiving federal monies, then you could not discriminate based on race, gender, religion.
The civil rights movement began to push back against some of these policies. Finally, in 1968, a Fair Housing Act was passed, which said that you couldn't discriminate in the sale or rental of most housing in the country. So, for example, Levittown could no longer bar African Americans from moving in.
The civil rights movement succeeds in making the express language of racism unacceptable publicly. It's unacceptable to say publicly, I stand for the white man, I believe in white supremacy. Now, there are people saying that, but they are increasingly on the fringe of American society, the Klan members, the sort of redneck racists.
All across the country, not just in the South, expressions of open racism instead went underground in the form of coded language or secret political messaging meant to appeal to segregationists.
I shall help make it possible for you and your families to walk the streets of our cities in safety.
I'm against busing. I do not believe that it serves education to pick up children that are 2 or 3 years behind children in another school district and haul them for a half hour across town to another district.
After a short stint in a public elementary school, I began attending one of the many white segregated academies that were created in the 1960s after desegregation. Race relations in the South were stuck in time. All around me, there was resistance to the changes brought by the Civil Rights Act. White privilege was finding a way to maintain itself. The national pushback against the civil rights movement and the laws it helped enact began right away. This resistance eerily mirrored what happened after Reconstruction. Political assassinations and the overturning of policies and laws gradually destroyed the gains made by African Americans.
From the beginning of our administration, we've taken strong steps to do something about this horror.
They are often the kinds of kids that are called super predators.
I think that Mississippi has a long way to go. There's still such segregation. It should have changed by leaps and bounds. And maybe it has by a skip.
Yeah, it was soon in the morning.
Back here in Meridian, we found an incident that took place in 2003 that struck us as an enduring example of the terrible consequences of not confronting racism directly.
The funerals for 3 Lockheed employees shot to death earlier this week were held today in both Mississippi and Alabama. Thomas Willis, the father of 3, a Vietnam War vet who was honored with a Purple...
I was immediately drawn to Thomas Willis. To me, his life seemed to personify the progress that has been made by African Americans in the U.S. since the passage of the Civil Rights Act.
Did you know Thomas Willis?
Yes. Played softball with Thomas. Friends with Thomas.
Can you tell me about Thomas, what kind of guy he was?
What impressed me the most was he had a good work ethic. He seemed to be a very stable individual.
Family-oriented. Loving. Strict. Firm. Fair.
Thomas Willis was a father and a grandfather. For an African American in the South, he was making good money in a union job assembling aircraft wings for Lockheed Martin, the largest military contractor in the world.
He took a lot of pride in what he did and was very appreciative of it.
As a U.S. government contractor, Lockheed is barred from discriminating against people based on their race, color, or national origin by Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. In 2001, Mr. Willis courageously reported to Lockheed management that he and his African-American co-workers were being intimidated by a white employee, Doug Williams. Williams worked the assembly line alongside Mr. Willis.
I'm not going to pull any punches with you. I'm going to ask you, do you believe that Doug Williams was a racist?
Check the form.
He had a problem with blacks in general and some blacks specifically.
Did he ever tell you why he thought a race war was coming?
He told me on one occasion that he thought that the society had got to the point where the blacks were giving everything and the white males no longer had anybody representing us. And he thought that that was the answer. Violence was the answer.
They called in an investigator to determine if there was any type of racial threats being made. And Mr. Willis told them exactly what was going on.
Thomas's comment to me was that he felt like the company ought to do something and that he wasn't going to quit until something was done.
He gave them at least 3 examples of death threats that were racially motivated. Now, they were directed at blacks working in the plant.
Doug Williams was ordered to attend diversity and anger management classes, but repeatedly refused to go. According to his African-American co-workers, he continued his racial taunts. One day, Williams put a white work bootie on his head.
I'm from the South, and everybody that I know what that signifies.
Some African-American employees assumed he was imitating the Ku Klux Klan and reported the incident to their supervisors.
He wore that not for a little while, he wore that all day. Finally, the assistant plant manager comes back down and says, Doug, Mr. Williams, you've got to take that bootie off your head.
Their conversation was quite escalated. Jack insisting that he pull the cap off, Doug refusing.
And he wanted to know not why he had to take it off, he wanted to know who had reported him. He wanted the names.
He did not want to give in because he thought that he had been falsely accused in this situation, that his intent was not racial, it was merely the hazing of the new employee, a practical joke.
Without approval from Lockheed, Williams took a week off. When he did return to work, he wasn't punished. Lockheed again ordered him to diversity class, and again he refused to go.
He was having a lot of anger about what Lockheed Martin was doing to him, went out to his truck, got his guns, and came back, and that's when the shooting started.
He had shotgun in his hand, rifle on his back, bullets draped on both sides of him.
And I got a good look at his eyes, and I'm not going to say per se he snapped, but there was something there that was out there.
Storms in the room. He goes by numerous white employees, doesn't shoot anybody, and Mickey Fitzgerald, a brave man, he was a white guy, stood up and said, Doug, you don't want to do this. Doug kills him.
Just point blank shot him in the head.
Williams then shot Sam Cockrell, whom Williams believed had complained to management about him.
And he goes straight to the area where the black co-workers that he had been intimidating worked.
He went around and shot us how he wanted to shoot us, where he wanted to shoot us.
He stood over Lynette McCall, and she begged for her life. He shot Thomas Willis in the back as he was running away.
We stepped over there to see what Shirley was saying, and she was saying, he's killed himself, he's killed himself. I remember regrouping emotionally, and it seemed like I was in a daze.
It was devastating because we had just buried my mother. And I was like, this can't be happening. And
the police found Thomas. We got his wallet back and found the Lockheed Martin investigator's card in there. The card was crinkled and sweaty, had been in his pocket of him working hours. A lot of events had occurred in the 18 months. A lot of water under the bridge of bad things. Nothing was happening.
it's like his voice was unheard. And that's what I'm kind of confused about. Why did it go unheard?
Listening to the investigations, listening to the things my dad brought to the table for Lockheed, and any real person, any sane person would know that something's not right. Why didn't you do more?
We filed suit for wrongful death under the Mississippi wrongful death statute, seeking damages for Mr. Willis being murdered in an intentional act. It went to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, which threw the case out based on the fact that it was a workplace accident.
When they ruled it as accidental, I know what that word means. Things happen. You leave a cord out, you trip, that's an accident. You didn't mean for that to happen. I understand that. But this was intentional.
At the time of the massacre, Lockheed held federal military contracts worth billions of dollars. If Lockheed had been found guilty of violating Thomas Willis and his colleagues' civil rights, it would have lost its lucrative government contracts. Today, Lockheed is still the largest employer in the area.
I do think there was a fairly significant effort to make sure it didn't become too public.
Vietnam veteran and law-abiding citizen Thomas Willis played by all the rules, and he was still struck down by a racist. If Mr. Willis's circumstances couldn't protect his civil rights, then who or what could?
I just wanted to see justice done. I needed somebody to say, hey, we will not allow this to happen again.
Another man done gone. Another man done gone from the county farm. Another man done gone.
How much damage has this done to communities of color? And the answer is enormous, enormous damage.
The country is becoming increasingly diverse. So the way race plays out today, not just in the South, but the whole country, is this profound anxiety that a lot of people have, especially white people have, about growing diversity. They're quite scared because they feel like they're about to lose not simply their neighborhood, but their sense of self, who they are. So when they talk about taking America back, they're not talking about taking it back from corporations. They're talking about taking it back from the Black Muslim foreigner in the White House. They're talking about taking it back from the other.
You see a presidency almost brought to ruin by the mere fact of hating him that intensely. The majority leader of the Senate, we won't do anything to make it possible for this person to succeed.
We're still suffering the after effects of those two powerful regimes that comprise the bulk of U.S. history, slavery and Jim Crow. You see it in terms of the population of our prisons. The United States imprisons more people probably than any other nation on planet Earth, a disproportionate percentage of whom are of African descent. You see it in healthcare outcomes, in terms of life expectancy. You see it in terms of per capita income on a racial basis. You see it even where you don't want to see it, in terms of black preschoolers being suspended at higher rates than other preschoolers, for example. I think that this culture has been created that is still, in some ways, punishing and penalizing Africans with, as noted, no interrogation of the lingering impact, no attempt to connect the dots between slavery, Jim Crow, and the present. And it's criminal because people are suffering and people are dying.
Is there anyone who can explain to me about the chains on fallen men? A king was born and they put him down. These are the days when they rise again. These are the days of dangerous men. Stand tall, walk free. Stay with me, brothers and sisters, stand tall, walk free.
There are many people who don't believe in equality. Many people believe there's a natural order of things and that whites are at the top. And to some extent, I would argue that we're still fighting the Civil War and the South is winning.
I absolutely think this country missed the opportunity to make a real difference in how we treat each other, how we think about each other. And I guess quite honestly, I'm not sure how it can be fixed.
Could she be right? Is there really no way out of this? One thing I know for sure is that oppression against African Americans has been relentless throughout our history. This history is not just in the past. It's still very much alive today.
The pain is constant, whether you're looking at something that happened on television and, or if you went to the grocery store. Mom and I both have been to two of the popular stores here on the island and have felt, and as Lynn had talked about her experience at the pizza parlor. So, it's not that we cannot forgive. It's not easy to forgive. If someone's standing on your foot and they're still standing on it, and every time, again, that wound gets opened when Ferguson,
exactly. Right.
We all know what's in the news. And so it's just a constant reopening of an old wound. Yeah. And that we are still just incredibly impacted.
Change it out to yellow. The yellow and purple. Yeah. I miss them. I've lost a father through this. Someone that I can't see anymore. Right. Mm-hmm.
Has the shooting affected you?
Yes, it has. I had to go through a lot of counseling to finally feel like that I turned the corner.
Through the years, I'm getting better, and I think we all are, but it helps by us being so close-knit. You get them sugar cubes?
No.
I know Daddy used to give them sugar cubes. I'm gonna fight to the end to try to make everybody see what's going on. The silence needs to be broken. We can't embed hate into one another. I'm not going to embed hate into my child.
We need to have an honest conversation. We need to sit down and put all of the issues on the table, not just the things that are fuzzy and feel good. We need to address the systematic racism that happens in this country. We need to dismantle the institutions that continue to keep not just African Americans, but people of color in general subjugated. And it's difficult, but it's something that needs to happen.
We need an official government commission to investigate and interrogate the lingering impact of both slavery and Jim Crow. Perhaps we need also some way to repair the damage.
I would think that the reparations that would be a practical achievement would take the form of refurbishing the black community in terms of the quality of schools and quality of housing. There has to be a significant economic change.
Leveling the playing field for African Americans seems to be one big answer. We tried this with Reconstruction and with the Civil Rights Movement. We saw what happened with the pioneering Black Canadians and the freed slaves of Robert Carter, who made the most of their opportunities. Today, their descendants continue to pursue their dreams in whatever ways they choose.
What I found in my research and dealing with these families that come from this manumission, all of them have this sense of pride in their family, the sense of pride in themselves, in their work and what they do.
We obtained certain advantages from being free peoples. If you look at our family structure, it stayed pretty intact. You know, we had 2 heads of the household.
It did in some ways give us a head start in that we had to be self-reliant far long before other people of color were free. That gets instilled into your family. It becomes a part of who you are. You pass that on to your children, to their children, and so on and so forth.
The hard nut of it is really whites. So we had it exactly backwards, right, in terms of the Negro problem. We have a white problem in the United States. And I don't mean this as a blame and whatever, but I think people won't get this on their own. That we really takes a lot of work, because this is so deeply in our DNA. And it's reflected in our politics, the way we do politics, the way we do economy, and the way we think about ourselves. But we actually need to give birth to a new white identity, a white identity that doesn't need to dominate, a white identity that's not totally angst about being in connection in relationship with the other, a white identity that recognizes that it is the other.
But to do this, we have to recognize that we as white people have benefited enormously from our privilege at the expense of other people. The cost of this prejudice and inequality has come at far too high a price. Why are we so afraid to face the possibility that we might actually gain something with true equality?
I'm striving, trying to make it through this barreling, yes sir, but as I go from day to day, I can hear my Savior say, trust me child, come on out.